Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
With the EU and the rest of the world. It will also help to decide our future arrangements for fishing and agriculture and immigration. But many people believe that just isn't enough time to negotiate. Today, The Independent published a leaked recording of the EU's chief negotiator. In it, Michel Barnier said that the 11-month timeframe to negotiate a trade deal was unrealistic. And with Johnson saying that he wouldn't extend the transition period, a no deal is still a possibility under a Conservative administration. So what will a Conservative majority mean for your future holidays, your dog passports, whether you can work in the EU, red tape for your business? Well, we just don't know. It depends on what the EU does and doesn't agree to. Back in Darlington, we asked the same question about Labour's Brexit policy.
He should have sort of made it clear where he stands, you know, because we're sort of in a limbo. It's going to be another referendum. We've been through that already.
Once again, though, there was some confusion about what the Labour policy would mean in practice.
Do you know what Labour's Brexit policy is?
Not for the last few months.
Jeremy Corbyn says his Brexit policy is simple.
Labour will get Brexit sorted within 6 months. We'll let the people decide whether to leave on a sensible deal or remain. It really isn't that complicated.
But not everyone thinks that. His central policy is to renegotiate with the EU a far closer relationship that he says would protect environmental and workers' rights. That deal would then be put back to the people against Remain.
Jeremy Corbyn has given himself 3 months to get a deal from Brussels. That is a very short time indeed, but we do have an idea of what that deal will look like. It will be a softer, much softer Brexit than the one that Boris Johnson will be going for. There is a danger, of course, that the Conservatives will decide to entirely boycott a referendum that is a very soft deal versus Remain, and will urge people to do that and not to vote at all. That will undoubtedly create division.
The other problem for Labour's Brexit policy is if they don't win a majority, and the polls suggest they won't, they'll have to work with other parties. That could see their Brexit policy shifted and shaped by others. Helpfully for Labour, most of the smaller parties support a second referendum. Fundamentally, though, the two men vying for the keys to this place have dramatically different positions on Brexit. Corbyn's policies would mean a much closer relationship with the EU than Mr Johnson's plan. That's, of course, if you trust they'll deliver what they say, and many of you simply don't.
Well, at the heart of the original Brexit plan are the ambitious new trade deals it wants to forge. Deals with the US, Australia and New Zealand, deals that will supposedly boost our economy and our living standards. But are we being fed a narrative of trading prosperity yet to be borne out by any facts? Here's our economics editor, Ben Chu, with some exclusive findings. Ben.
What can we say about tomorrow's vote? What we can say about what it will mean for the economy. So let's leave aside for the moment questions of nationalisation, tax rises, etc., and focus just on Brexit. Now, the various parties have taken very different positions on Brexit, as we've been hearing. But if the Conservatives are elected and Britain leaves the EU with the withdrawal agreement negotiated by Boris Johnson, there's no doubt that we will see a major shift in the UK's trade relations with the rest of the world. So the Conservatives have been clear on the economic benefits of Brexit, repeatedly highlighting the potential for new trade deals with the likes of America, Australia and New Zealand. But just how economically beneficial would these new trade deals be? And can they compensate for the loss of frictionless trade with the EU? Well, exclusive research commissioned by Newsnight from independent experts at the UK Trade Policy Observatory suggests that the answer is an emphatic no. The blue bar you're going to see here shows the negative impact over roughly the next 5 years on the UK economy of leaving the EU with a free trade deal. The result, minus 1.8% of GDP compared to the current frictionless arrangement. What if you add in those new free trade deals with Australia, New Zealand and the US? Well, look at the pink bar, still negative, minus 1.4% of GDP. So to put that in context, that minus 1.4% of GDP equates to a 28 billion hit to the UK economy, equivalent to around £1,000 for every UK household. And remember, this is very much a best case scenario where we get a free trade deal with the EU and then also succeed in completing all these new deals with other countries. So why are the results of those new free trade deals set to be so disappointing? Here's what the author of the research told us.
It's basic arithmetic, really. About 50% of our trade is with the EU, between 15 and 20% is with the US, Australia and New Zealand. So if you raise barriers to trade with the EU, that's going to have a negative impact on trade. You're going to have to lower barriers by an awful lot with the US, Australia and New Zealand to get a compensating increase in trade. And those barriers to trade in terms of tariffs are already pretty low.
And here's another interesting finding. Newsnight has learned that the government has conducted its own internal impact assessments of US, Australian and New Zealand trade deals, but not yet released them. Yet we understand that they show something very similar to what our independent trade experts have found. Now, of course, we put our results to the Conservatives, and they said in a statement to us, the Prime Minister's fantastic deal makes clear that we will have a future relationship based on free trade and friendly cooperation. By striking trade deals around the world, we will create exciting new opportunities for British businesses. Emily.
Ben, thanks very much indeed. We'll discuss what tomorrow's result could mean for Brexit. We're joined by Philip Rycroft, a former permanent secretary at the Department for Exiting the European Union, Professor Anand Menon, Director of UK and a Changing Europe, and Maddie Timont-Jack, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Government. And Philip, I'm going to come back to some of Ben's findings about trade in a moment. But first, James raised some questions in his piece about what we've learned during the campaign, the questions about what it means for red tape or tourism or working abroad or pet passports. Do you feel that any of those have been addressed or clarified or answered?
No, none of them. I think that the paradox of this campaign has been the Prime Minister has wanted to talk about Brexit, but only in one phrase: get Brexit done. No one has been interested in discussing the details of what Brexit might mean, let alone exploring what the different kinds of Brexit we could carry out might mean.
Is that just because we need to finalise the withdrawal and he can't give any details now because that involves more negotiations with Europe, or could he be fleshing out stuff that he's chosen not to?
Well, there are things fleshed out in the Tory manifesto. For instance, we won't be under the ECJ, we won't be aligning with single market rules, we won't be part of a customs union. There are some pretty clear clues there that actually what the Conservatives are after is a fairly bare bones FTA with the European Union, nothing like the kind of deal that the Labour Party seem to be wanting, which is far, far deeper, far closer, and as such will have far less severe economic implications.
Do you have a sense, Philip, of what kind of Brexit would be possible by the deadline that the PM has set himself, December of next year?
So the first thing to note, of course, is we will have left the EU. We will leave the EU under those circumstances at the end of January. So that is one sort of Brexit. But what we won't have sorted out is the future relationship. In other words, the consequences of leaving the EU. And that will take time. It is feasible, I think, to do a very thin free trade agreement by the end of the year, but that will not be the totality of the story. That will not complete the suite of things that we need to do to establish our long-term future relationship with the EU. And doing a deal in that time frame will mean that we will have to offer concessions to the EU to get that over the line.
What do you mean by concessions?
So if you look at what a thin free trade deal might involve, it will focus on industrial goods, possibly agri-food as well. You might get a tariff-free, quota-free deal, or zero tariff, zero quota deal. You'll get something on rules of origin, mutual recognition and so on. But in return for that, the EU would demand some pretty binding rules on the so-called level playing field issues. This is labour market rules, environmental rules, state aid rules. These are the things that they worry about to stop the UK getting an unfair competitive advantage.
Just to break that down, are you saying that we would remain aligned to get that deal through?
So one possibility is that there are the so-called non-regression clauses, so that we would have to maintain the standards we have now. The other possibility is that they would demand what's so-called dynamic alignment, whereby the UK standards would have to adjust as the EU standards change over time. I suspect that's a negotiating demand from them too far, because I think from what has been said by the Conservative Party over time, they'd find that very difficult to swallow. But nevertheless, this would be a big moment. And the other thing to remember, another big demand from the EU, fisheries, always critical in EU negotiations and politically very totemic.
You mean they could ask for more in exchange for this?
Fisheries, so we take back control of British waters. They will want access to those waters for their boats. They have access now.
Maddie, this is a scenario in which we are imagining the Conservatives have a majority tomorrow. Let's stay with this and then we'll examine a Labour victory. But under this scenario, do you think the size of the majority or even the geography of the seats won would impact what kind of deal happens next?
Well, I think the size of the majority will be important. So under the sort of last draft of the withdrawal agreement bill, this is the piece of legislation that needs to be implemented to pass to implement the first phase of Brexit. There would have to be a vote in Parliament both on the negotiating objectives before the UK can start negotiating with the EU on the next phase, but also a vote on the sort of final deal that's agreed before the government can ratify it. So if Boris Johnson does have quite a large majority, then you'd imagine it would give him a bit more flexibility in terms of making different trade-offs during the negotiations, because a small group of Conservative MPs won't be able to sort of hold him to account in the same way that we have seen groups of Conservative MPs play quite an important role on the first phase. So I think that the size will matter, but also the sort of makeup of the Conservative Party. So it really depends on which MPs are returned.
Is your sense, though, that once we're through the withdrawal agreement, if we are through the withdrawal agreement next week, then there is no particular influence over the kind of Brexit that Parliament has. Is that right?
I don't think we can necessarily predict that. I think it really does depend on the result that we see on Friday. I think there are moments when Parliament can decide to assert itself if it wants to, but if the Conservative Party does have a big majority, then that influence has been reduced. And you can imagine that actually, if MPs vote through the withdrawal agreement, then, as Philip says, we'll have left the EU. And if the government is very determined not to seek an extension to that transition period, there will be a lot of pressure on MPs to approve whatever comes back, particularly those who might be concerned at a sort of no-deal exit on sort of the future relationship at the end of December 2020.
I mean, what I would say is I think you were right in saying that the geography matters, because if Boris Johnson is very successful, if the red wall crumbles, if all those traditional Labour seats in the Midlands and the North end up with Tory MPs, these are seats with disproportionate concentrations of manufacturing industry. If you think about the West Midlands and the car industry. Now, I'm not saying it will happen, but it is at least feasible that the MP for Wolverhampton South or wherever, who might be a Conservative, says, hang on a sec, Jaguar Land Rover, they're ringing me up every day saying we need a customs relationship with the European Union, or their business model is at threat. And so
you don't really imagine that a customs union or a single market would re-enter the equation at this point, do you?
No, not necessarily. But what I'm saying, though, is it is not just the size of the Tory majority, but who's in it and what the constituencies they are going to be trying to defend.
Can I try and get you to give me a sense, in a very concrete way, as far as possible, of how this will change our lives? I mean, we've talked so much about free trade and EFTA and Canada Plus and Norway and all the kind of stuff over the last year, but if I am a business or if I'm a tourist, or even going back to that original point, if I'm a pet owner that wants to go abroad, how will this actually change our lives once it's done?
So the sort of trade deal that Mr Johnson is contemplating, whether it's done at the end of next year or later, has the same sort of impact. For tourists, there's almost certainly will have visa-free travel. I think that's relatively straightforward to negotiate. Pet passports is always a big one. It would depend a little bit, I think, on whether we're staying within the sort of same regime for looking after animal health. That will have to be negotiated. So individuals, I don't think, will see a big impact in terms of travel and so on.
But it's services,
but businesses will see a big impact. The whole point of coming out and leaving the single market is we put a border in place. The border, even if you're not paying tariffs, still requires paperwork, customs declarations, regulatory checks, and so on and so forth. That puts costs on business. Cost means that UK businesses will be less competitive selling to the continent. It means that integrated European supply chains are disrupted, and that will have an economic impact. That explains those numbers. The
integrated supply chain means what? The sort of
integrated supply chain. So if you look at a vehicle that is produced in the UK for export to the EU, parts for that vehicle will have shuttled across the channel time and again to build that car. And it's what you put is in friction into that trading relationship.
Okay, so let's flip over now. Let's imagine a Labour victory, or Labour is in a power where they can decide the direction of Brexit now. And their pledge is 6 months, and they can get it done. They can get a deal renegotiated and a second referendum. Maddie?
Well, I mean, I think the challenge in that, I mean, there's the one sort of question of, can they renegotiate something with the EU? I think they've said they want to do that by the end of March. And although there's sort of some discussion that, yes, they want a closer relationship with the EU, we're still not actually quite sure whether they'll accept even the withdrawal agreement that currently has been negotiated. So we know that they're likely to accept the citizens' rights provisions, transition, financial payments, although they might have to look to extend transition, you know, if we did end up leaving, because it is due to end at the December 2020. But we don't quite know whether they're happy with sort of Boris Johnson's version of the backstop, or whether they prefer Theresa May's version of the backstop, given that they want a closer relationship. But on the other hand, they've also got to be able to hold a referendum, is legislate for holding a referendum in Parliament. And, you know, we've looked at it, it would normally take, you'd expect, around 6 months to do that, particularly to give time for the Electoral Commission to test questions, you know, those sorts of things. And I think the big question is, are they going to start legislating for a referendum without knowing quite what they're going to be holding a referendum on at that point?
Simultaneously.
That's what they're saying they would do.
And you've been involved in referendum. You've done Scotland, you've done an EU referendum. Does this make sense to you as a strategy?
Well, what Maddie said is absolutely right. To have a referendum properly constituted takes time. It's not just about the bare bones of the legislation. Don't forget, there was quite a lot of criticism around the controls on social media and so on for the last referendum. Fixing all of that is quite big policy issues. That too would take time. If the result is very close, this stuff matters, because if you haven't done it right and allowed enough time, then the legitimacy of that referendum outcome would be challenged.
Is there a Europe feeling here? Do you think the EU would influence whether they wanted to see a second referendum, or they wanted to give a deal that would enable that or not enable it? I mean, do you think anyone wants Britain to stay anymore?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Have they just got so fed up with this that they think it is now time to move on? I'm pretty certain if an incoming government asked for an extension, of course they would have to do to hold a referendum, that extension would be allowed. But how far the EU would go out of its way to change the conditions of the deal that was been done, that is a moot point.
I'd say the other problem with the Labour position is their plans for the future are very ambiguous. So they talk about joint UK-EU trade deals. I'm not quite sure what that means. They talk about alignment with the single market. That could be something very minimal, all the way up to Norway. So we're going to have to wait and see, get some flesh on those bones before we know whether that is negotiable, or whether the EU is going to say, actually, we're not sure. I mean, it might not be an easy negotiation.
So last scenario then, a hung parliament. Can we vote our way out of this, or does a hung parliament send us straight back to the ballot box?
Well, I mean, there are two things worth saying, aren't there? We've got a new speaker, so I think Parliament is going to find it harder to take control of its own business than it did under the former speaker. And the second thing is we shouldn't underestimate the problems inherent in legislating for a referendum. There are lots of very tricky questions, from what is the question, what is the franchise? I'm sure some of the parties will be pushing for under 18s to vote for EU citizens. It'll be hard to get that through.
Is it fair to say that 2020 will be dominated by Brexit, whatever happens, whoever wins, whoever loses?
I think if there is in some circumstances, an incoming government with a majority, they will have a very big incentive to make Brexit as dull and boring as possible, get it off the front pages. Whether they'll succeed in that depends on whether they can get a good deal done. I worry more, frankly, about issues around the coherence of the United Kingdom. There's a lot of unfinished business. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the integrity of the United Kingdom, I think, will be a big part of the agenda for any incoming government over the next 5 years.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.